Hello, welcome, and this is Ask the Hearing Doctors. My name is Dr. Jenna Valania. I'm one of the audiologists at Hearing Doctors, the Washington, D.C. metro area's highest rated audiology clinic with over 1,500 five-star reviews. I'm very grateful to be joined today by Matt Hay. He was with us on one of our segments about the Redux equipment for hearing aids, and I'm really interested in hearing his story about his hearing loss, as he is someone with hearing loss.
Well, thanks for having me. This has been a fun day. You might end up with 1,501 five-star reviews after today.
Thank you. Tell us a little bit about your hearing loss and how did you get to where you are today?
Sure. I guess the short answer to that is I'm 44 and I spent the first half of my life losing my hearing and the second half of my life regaining my hearing. The longer answer to that is I grew up around lawnmowers and cutting firewood, and I think in the 80s, at least in southern Indiana, we didn't give a whole lot of thought to hearing care. So when I started failing some of those beep tests in school, we didn't think much of it. In my sophomore year at Indiana, I lost almost all the hearing in one ear. And I know that because on my landline telephone, I stopped being able to hear on the phone. My invincible frat guy, 19-year-old mentality was that obviously there's something wrong with my phone. And when I got home that summer, my parents were floored by how noticeable my hearing loss was. So they sent me to an audiologist. I was happy to prove them wrong. Audiologist said, yeah, your hearing's pretty bad. We, in fact, think you need to go see an ENT because your results are coming back very inconclusive. The ENT said, we want you to have an MRI. So this is certainly not the direction I thought that appointment was going to go. And the MRI showed bilateral acoustic neuromas. At the time, they were about a centimeter or 2 centimeters each. And I was diagnosed with Neurofibromatosis 2, or NF2, which is a neurological disorder that means I lack a protein that you luckily have. That prevents tumors from growing on your nerve sheaths. Because I don't have that protein, NF2 means tumors can grow on any nerve sheath in my body, which is bad news because you've got about 50 miles of nerves in your body. So I have the bilateral acoustic neuromas and a few other superficial nerves, or superficial tumors. But that was the time when I met a surgeon and he said, Matt, you're probably going to lose your hearing. Like you need, I'm 19, 20 years old now, and said you need to prepare for a life where your hearing's going to go away, which is pretty hard words to hear, even if you have good hearing, hard words to hear.
Absolutely. So at that time, were you wearing a hearing aid, or was this, you went from I'm going to go and improve them wrong to pretty much the opposite of what you were expecting to hear?
That's a great question. The hearing loss in 1 year happened so quickly, and really at 19, what do you know about hearing aids? And so when I got that diagnosis, they said you're at a point where you need to get aids. Mm-hmm. I was very fortunate that I was going to college at Indiana. I had an incredible speech and hearing department. And I met the director of the speech and hearing department, and this would have been 1997. And Dr. Hipskin is still a very close mentor and friend of mine. Mm-hmm. And in exchange for me allowing students to practice taking ear molds, he gave me free hearing aids and free hearing care. So about once a quarter, I would go over and sit in the basement, and the students would line up with their caulk guns. And you guys are terrible at ear molds when you're first years. And they would take these molds. But he taught me, or told me, and made me aware of vocational rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, I was able to essentially get free hearing aids for the next 5 years of my life. So that's the good part. The bad part is my hearing continued to decline because those tumors continued to grow on my hearing nerves. I was updating those hearing aids from in the canal to behind the ear. Now I needed 2 hearing aids. And then eventually started getting to a point where I wasn't even hearing with my aids, I was feeling. I would feel the vibration. And so it got to a point where we knew I was no longer going to get the help that I needed from a hearing aid. And we were looking at cochlear implants, but what separates so I ended up looking at auditory brainstem implants, which is something the FDA had approved just that year. So I mean, to call it experimental is not a stretch.
Right.
But a cochlear implant, and I certainly don't know the science of the ear like you do, but let's say there's 10 steps. A cochlea can help on step 5. A cochlear implant helps on step 5 in your cochlea. Because my nerve damage was step 10. It's like I have my ears this perfectly paved highway with bright yellow, lines, but the bridge is out at the very end, and that's the hearing nerve. So no kind of traditional hearing care was going to help me anymore. So what the Auditory brainstem implant does, and this is what I ended up getting, was they sew 21 electrodes onto the part of your brain that they think processes sound. And it looks like a tiny little fly swatter, and some brilliant surgeons at the House Ear Institute in Los Angeles attached this little fly swatter to my brainstem and they took out the larger tumor and said, we think this is going to work. We think you might hear life sounds. So 6 weeks later, they turned it on with the expectation that I might hear life sounds.
Okay. So what was that process like? If you don't mind me asking, of course, and if you don't mind sharing.
I say this kind of half joking, but it's the truth, is that there's never been a better time in history to be hard of hearing. And there are so many reasons why that's true. When I went into this, the date for surgery was picked because I finally lost all my hearing. That even though I knew this day was coming and I had done everything I could to prepare for it, I had tried to learn sign and lip reading, nothing prepares you for the day that you wake up and you can't hear. And I can't overstate the heaviness of that, of the idea of waking up and your hearing stops being a sense. That's one thing, like, oh yeah, that would be hard. But when you frame it as, what if your hearing was only a memory? Like, what if hearing was only something that in your memory? And that's exactly what happens when you wake up deaf, is it's a memory. Everything, every voice you've ever heard, the sound of your feet, the sound of your breath, not to mention music. Are you one day going to hear your kids? Like, that's all gone. You can't prepare for that. I know, and I tried hard, but you can't prepare for that. So that was when they said, all right, we're going to schedule the surgery. So when somebody promises life noises, well, when you can't hear anything, life noises are pretty awesome. I don't even know what that means, but what it means is police sirens and oven timers.
Okay.
An oven timer was a choir of angels when you can't hear anything. We just have evolved. Our brain wants to process sound. And when you can't do that, your ears start ringing. And so my world wasn't quiet.
Sure.
Because I was serenaded with 2 freight trains in both ears all the time of just this incessant ringing. And so the hope was the implant's going to work. Now, fortunately, the surgery to remove the tumor was successful, but I ended up with facial paralysis, which is a whole other thing. The real challenge with facial paralysis is when you prepare for not taking sound, processing information in, but then you lose your ability to smile. You've lost your ability to communicate out. So communication is a 2-way street, and I woke up after surgery with not both lanes closed, and that was very hard. Fortunately, I can grow a little beard and cover some synkinesis and spend a decade doing facial rejuvenation exercises, so I have a little bit of that smile back. But they turned the ABI on, and I was very fortunate that 12 of the 21 electrodes worked. I say fortunate because that meant I had 12 electrodes that sounded like a gravel truck. And they said, this might be it. We're the most experienced ABI clinic in the world, and we've done a couple hundred of these ever. The FDA just approved it a couple of years ago. And so it became very zen. I would say things don't sound right. And my audiologist, a wonderful man named Steve Otto, would say, no, that's just the way things sound now, man. It was like, that's the attitude that I needed was.
Right.
And anybody with hearing loss can relate to this. You put in a new hearing aid and things don't sound right. There's a little bit of zen involved in that of, well, you know what? This is the way things sound now. And a couple things can happen. I can work at it. I can practice. I can get used to it, or I can just go through every day saying, that doesn't sound right, that sounds bad. And I didn't want that to be my future. So I had to have a little bit of an attitude adjustment about how I would approach the way things sound.
Sure, and how, you mentioned that it's really hard to put into words what losing that sense is like. How was those first months, those first years? I mean, right now, if you were turned to face me this way where I don't see the implant, you would have no idea. And as a professional, I know the amount of work that goes into it. I know some of the professionals that you've worked with, and I know the amount of work that you've put into getting where you are today. How'd you do it? How'd you learn to hear again?
So I think for me in life, there's been a two-step process to get places. One is deciding what you want to do. It's easy to say, I want to hear again, but that was a motivation. That was the first step. The second step is finding the motivation to do that. And I think that's the really hard part. Mm-hmm. What motivation do I need to hear again? Well, I'm newly married. The idea of not hearing your wife say, I love you ever again, that's a pretty freaking great motivation to try to hear a little bit better. Then you start thinking, am I ever going to hear my kids? And then, you don't have kids yet, but in the future, if they, I want to hear, I love you, Dad. But more than that, if they cry and need me and I can't hear that because I chose not to work hard enough to do that, shame on me. So that was the motivation I needed. And I would say the first year I wore my implant every day and I hated it. Everything sounded like gravel trucks, and after a year, everything sounded like gravel trucks. And after 2 years, everything sounded like 2 gravel trucks. And that was a huge, I didn't know it at the time, but that's huge progress. I'm probably going to oversimplify this, but my understanding of hearing is step 1 is awareness. Step 2 is differentiation. If you can differentiate 2 different sounds, that's a big deal. And so, but when your world sounds like 2 gravel trucks and you can differentiate those, that's kind of hard to get excited about. But I wore it, and it got a little better. To a point where I could call my wife on the phone, and when I would ask yes, no questions, and she would answer 1 for yes, 2 for no. Yes or no, no. And that's how we would communicate on the phone, and that was awesome. I could use the phone. But I mentioned there's never been a better time to be hard of hearing. CapTel didn't exist. Now it does. Mm-hmm. Texting didn't exist. Now it does. What we know about brain hearing is so far away better than what it was 20 years ago. So those tools are out there. Probably another lesson I learned that, I learned it about hearing, but there's probably a lot of life lessons here, is if you just wait for the thing to come to you, it might accidentally come, whether that's help or assistance or a tool or a professional. If you just sort of drift along and wait for that help to come, it might. But if you go out and look for it and you be intentional about trying to find that help and do that thing, it's going to come a lot faster. And so I made the decision to be intentional about what I was doing. Fortunately, after 12 years, I had about a 40% hit recognition. And everybody said, holy cow, that's amazing for an AVI. And my brain kind of got fat and lazy and said, I'm leading the minor leagues in home runs, right? I'm doing pretty well with my AVI. But then who had kids and I couldn't tell their voices. And I thought, well, this is that new motivation that I need. Mm-hmm. And I started listening to music, and it was awful. And everything sounded the same. I couldn't tell the difference between dogs barking Jingle Bells and Pavarotti. Everything was the same. We had a CD from our wedding called Songs We Like, and it had been gathering dust, and a word of original stuck to it, and because it had been in my console in my car, and I hadn't listened to it in a decade. And I thought, I'm going to start listening to those songs over and over and over again. Same 12 songs. A year later, still nothing. And then one day we were in the car, and my wife turns on the car, and she gets ready to turn the music down, because when I'm not in the car, she rocks out. Now, when I'm in the car, we turn the music down. And I grabbed her wrist and said, "Is that Crazy Game of Poker by OAR?" which is a band we had seen at the House of Blues the year I lost my hearing. And we pulled over and cried. It's like, I heard music. Like we talk on the phone, 1 for yes and 2 for no, as of 2 years ago, and today I heard the song on the radio. We listened to the rest of the song, the rest of the album, never heard another word. But motivation, right?
Yes.
I had identified the motivation I needed. And I started using my own music therapy. And I now have a 66 song playlist, because every time I work through a song over and over again. What I did wrong, though, and the advice that unsolicited advice I would give to somebody is I did it on my own. And it's like learning to golf on your own or learning to swim on your own. There are professionals out there that are really good at this. And if I had known or been brave enough to say, here's the thing I'm bad at, can you help me? We're all bad at asking for help. If I had done that, what took me years to get to 66 songs might have taken months. That's a lesson I'm still trying to learn. But as in my role with Redux now, having the opportunity to meet with so many just amazing, dedicated hearing care professionals, there are really great people to work with that can help, whether it's speech understanding or auditory processing disorder, or just I've had hearing aids and they don't work, or they get wet or whatever. There are some amazing solutions out there, right? Best time ever to be in history to have bad hearing.
So you bring up a great point about how there are professionals that can help with whether that's, I'm 19 years old, I'm in a frat, and I think my phone is broken, to now I have a ABI and I am learning to hear music again. I'm learning to hear my kids' voices. Something that we do here is we are adding in what's called auditory processing therapy, and then the training that comes with it, and the diagnosis of auditory processing disorder. And there are some things that people have the perception about audiologists that all they do is couple beeps, raise your hand, okay, am I done now? Can I get out of this little booth? But you've sought out some auditory processing therapy and some training. Can you tell me a little bit about, so you mentioned the HINT. So to our viewers, the HINT is a hearing and noise test.
Yeah.
What did that mean to you, going from I can understand about 40% to where you are today?
So I mentioned doing things with intention, and when I first heard about auditory processing, when I didn't know what it was, and then when I learned more about it, I thought, well, that's not going to help me. I've had my implant for 17 years. What are you going to do in year 18 that I didn't do? And so I had very low expectations. But what was different about this than anything I had ever done is, for the first decade, I thought, I'm just going to hear better by existing in the world. There's no intention in just existing. But then when I started focusing on individual songs, I went from here to here, and my hearing got better. And then I started working on individual words, and my hearing got better. So to me, APD training was just an additional extension of that, where now instead of working on words, we're going to work on the specific sounds that make up words. The difference between "m" or "n." Well, I shouldn't be able to hear that. I'm deaf. I mean, and this thing stops touching my head. I am bilaterally totally deaf. But practicing with such specific intention, like I said, I didn't think it was going to work. And I know that the scores from that went up, but what does that mean to me? I don't know what those scores, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with APD scores, but I do know hint recognition. I know that I was at 40 before I started studying music. I moved to 60 over a 5-year period of listening to music. I was at a 65 on my hint scores in December of 2019. In the pandemic, nobody did anything. This year, I did 20 very intensive hours of APD training, and the outcome of my most recent ABI implant, or ABI mapping, which is probably my 25th update, I went from 65 to 96%. So my unaided open sentence recognition was 96%. I didn't do anything different except 20 hours of APD training. My hint scores were high enough that for the first time ever, my audiologist said, I'd like you to try AZ biosynthesis. But at this time, she knows that I'm very competitive with myself. And I care deeply about what those percentages are and what grade I can give myself. And she said, Matt, you're going to fail. Like, I just want you to be okay that these are just not even on the same page as the hint sentences.
Sure.
And I scored a 78%. And it's a C+, but I'm deaf, right? Like, I'm deaf. My ears do nothing except keep my sunglasses from sliding off my face. And my AZ bio scores are 78%. And I credit the professional training to doing that.
It's truly incredible, really. The amount of not only science that goes into hearing, because right now, just like you said, your ears are not doing anything for you to help bring that sound up into that auditory pathway. But the combination of science and perseverance, and that's just what I've been able to gain from your story and meeting individuals like you. The science is one thing. We give you the science. You bring that perseverance back into every single appointment. And you're not just hearing in our 1 hour appointment or in your 1 hour appointment on auditory training. You're doing work every single day. And it's truly that dedication that keeps us as professionals moving forward and keeps people that are brand new to hearing loss inspired to do better and to hear better. And we really thank you for sharing your story today.
I appreciate it. And you're not asking this question, but I think if I can leave with one thing, it is walking in, you're not scary at all, but walking in here if you have hearing loss is scary. It's scary because I'm going to walk in and you're going to tell me what I'm bad at. And nobody wants that. So I would encourage anybody listening to this to know that there's no better use of 1 hour of your time of just coming to learn. That there's nothing scary about being in here. You've got candy and water. You got to come in and just learn. And I feel confident that if anybody is willing to take that step and be able to maybe put their ego aside and be okay at being bad at a thing, that you guys, you're here. You exist in this role to make them hear better. And I have no doubt that they're going to find that as a good use of their time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Sure thing.
If you're in the Washington metropolitan area and you'd like to schedule an appointment with hearing doctors, click the link in the description or visit hearingdoctors.com.